Welcome to Grub and Grace, where the music that avocados enjoy squawk and roll. I am Mark Flower, and today we will be gleaning some information about the Book of Ruth with Pastor Esther Park. So, take this journey with us as we dig in. Thanks for coming in, Esther.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to do this podcast.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Esther Park, and I serve with my husband at a local church in Aurora, Colorado. It's called Newgate Church. I serve in the children's department, but I really have a heart and a passion for seeing the church as a whole. So not just like separate ministries that are siloed, but to see the whole church work together in discipleship. So when I've even referred to the kids, I talk to our volunteers, just telling them, there are younger brothers and sisters. They're not just like kids that as if it's a daycare, but that we're leading them and we're guiding them also.
And I got to say, you do a great job with the kids.
Oh, thank you.
For our listeners, I actually attend the same church. So we met each other through the church. I get to see her in action with the kids and teaching the kids different stories and just guiding them on their journey through their faith journey.
Yeah, we're so grateful to have you, Mark, as one of our volunteers. And I would say, yeah, you're so valuable to us because we need like models. We need the kids to see adults like in and out and modeling different things for them. So we're so happy to have you on board.
That's a pleasure. All right. Why don't we jump right into our topic here? So we're going to be talking about the book of Ruth, a couple different themes throughout the book of Ruth. And Esther she's done research on the book of Ruth and has a good idea of what she wants to talk about. So I will let you just go ahead and just kick it off. However you want to jump into it.
I think my first introduction to Ruth, I think in a more formal or academic way, was through seminary. I took a exegesis class. So we literally read through the Hebrew and transliterated it into English. And then we did exegesis, which is, taking the word of God and pulling out God's message through that. And so just going through it line by line, verse by verse, really allowed the message and the words to sink in, I think, a little deeper. Of course, I needed more historical information too. And so that brought back a lot more to Ruth. So Ruth is relatively short, 4 chapters. And as a kid, I enjoyed reading it because it was so short. Also probably because it highlighted women too, just because my name is Esther. I loved the book of Esther also, but Ruth really was fun to dive into when I was a young kid. And so diving in and studying it further in seminary, I think brought a lot of pieces together. And some of the themes there were things I had been aware about, like being a foreigner or God's love for his people. But it definitely went deeper than that. And so I have a great appreciation for it. So Mark, when you said, hey, like, here's a list of things that we can talk about, and Ruth was on there, I was so excited.
I was really excited too. I was really excited that you picked this because you're a very knowledgeable person from the conversations we've had. I know you know what you're talking about, and I can tell you put your time in to really study the word and figure this stuff out. I really didn't want to do a topic like this with another man. I feel like there's so many voices out there that are men talking about books like Ruth and Esther. I just didn't want to be another voice like that. I considered doing it with my wife on this topic, and she still wants to talk about it. She wants to talk about different aspects like farming and that sort of thing.
Yes.
I kind of want to get some farmers' opinion, like actual farmers.
Yes.
So I might reach out to some farmers, maybe do a second episode on this book.
That's very cool.
Just for that, because there's so much you could really dig into this. I mean, you saw the theme list that I sent you. We only picked 3, but I picked out like 10 different themes that we could possibly talk on this.
So many themes here. Talking about farming reminds me of like Clarkson Farms on Amazon Prime. I've been watching that, and it's so incredible, like so fun. Do you know what the show is?
No.
It's a guy who's super into cars, but then he owns a farm in England. Jeremy Clarkson, and then he makes all these mistakes while farming, and it's really hilarious because he makes mistakes, but also weather and other factors fall into it. So I feel like it's almost like it's just a fun reality show, but it's almost like a PR to everyone. Like, hey, yeah, farmers complain about this and that, but it's very valid concerns.
I might have to check that one out.
It's really fun. So like you said, the themes that we wanted to cover are 3 out of like so many. And that's why I think I really love diving into Ruth, because it has so many different layers. It's not just the story of one woman, Naomi, going to a foreign land and then coming back with a foreigner, but who's a daughter-in-law, and kind of being adopted by the whole community. And then redemption, but just so much. I've even like thought about, when brainstorming for like sermons, thought about how to incorporate this like phrase of the God of reversals, because literally Ruth is an outcast, and then she somehow gets into the whole genealogy of Jesus, which is pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think she's only three generations away from the line of David.
Mm-hmm. King David. I mean, who would have thought?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So one of the big themes that came up in my study was Hesed, which is God's loving kindness. And when I was studying it, I think the books like emphasize that it's not like a simple word or an idea that can be translated easily into the English language. In fact, I can name here 8 different things that it means, but it's a very strong relational term, which speaks, I think, volumes of our God, that he is a very relational God. So Hesed actually means love, mercy, grace, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness. So somewhere in the intersection of all 8 of those words for us in the English language is where Hesed stands. And so I actually had preached this initially to 4th through 6th graders at my previous church in Southern California, and then to I would say largely maybe Hispanic and homeless congregation through our homeless ministry through the church, and then 2 more times since then. And so every time like I need to come up with like a message on the fly, like I think I really rely on Ruth, not just because it's already well constructed, but because there's like so much depth to it.
I feel like with so much interpretation for what Hesed means, I feel like people can really misconstrue that very easily, like a lot of the parts of the Bible. Like I'm learning Korean a little bit, and there's, of course, words that don't translate 100% into English.
Yes, absolutely.
And, but
Nukihe.
Yeah.
Like some people say, oh, it's oily, but it's not really oily. It's not really like, I don't know. There's no equivalent word translation.
Oh, what was the other one? It was nunchi or something?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
My brother even makes a joke like, oh, someone needs to water their noon trees. Like they need to have more tact and kind of social awareness of the situations. Yeah,
that's one of the, there's not a definite definition, but you can describe, having tact, and you kind of get the sense of what that word means, but it's not that definitive translation, and it's really difficult to get everything across that you need to without understanding that word in the context that it's being used and the language it's being used.
Totally. I totally agree. In my study, I saw that different characters of Ruth showed Hesed. So of course the main characters, right? Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, but it's this whole kind of sub-character going on, which is Boaz's workers, the citizens of Bethlehem, and the women of the town, and even God in the background, right? God is mentioned as the Lord several times, but he's not like a forefront character in the Ruth story. And so I can give us a few examples of each of these kind of 6 characters. So Naomi, she shows Hesed to her daughter-in-laws who are foreigners, who are Moabites. And she gives them a chance to just return home and kind of attempt to restart their life. I don't know how easy that was back then, but at least she gave them a chance, and it's not normal, right? Even she's like had this long-winded argument of, even if I were to have a child tonight, would you still wait? There's no point in you following me or like coming with me. She constantly refers to them as her daughters. And she literally was watching out for them, not because they were married into the family, but she really dearly cared for them. And that's an example of Hesed. Regarding Ruth, her declaration, very bold declaration in Ruth 1, verse 16, I'll just read part of the verse. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. This is kind of, I see it on coloring pages, and it's a very bold statement because she is a foreigner, and I'm sure she understood kind of the implications that she would need to integrate into being an Israelite, which is very homogeneous. Although they had allowances for the sojourner or things within God's law, they were still very judgmental, very, I would even say racist, if that makes sense. And so to make this bold statement, it just said no, Naomi, I don't care that you lost your husband and your sons. You're like my own mother. I'm gonna follow you. And so verse 17 goes on a bit further. It says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Ruth is not concerned with being in her own hometown, nor belonging to her people or fitting in there. She just, kind of belongs to Naomi. And in essence, she's saying I belong to God, let him have his will with me. For Boaz, he is such an upstanding man and character in the city of Bethlehem, which is really cool, right? Jesus, right, was born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread, but because there was a famine, they literally left the house of bread to Moab, Naomi's family, in order to find food and sustenance. But they returned to this house of bread. And here Boaz is, and he's a farmer, and in his farming tactics, he's very generous. Just as God had commanded before, don't glean to the edges, leave things for the birds of the air, and here he's extending his kind of riches and abundance. And I think giving credit to God, who he's saying God has richly blessed me, so I can give to others who are in need in my community. And so he says in Ruth 2, verse 8, my daughter, he's referring to Ruth, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. He has heard that Naomi has returned and of Ruth's kind of reputation, which is a really good one. And he wants to protect her. He wants to provide for her, so to speak. And so even Ruth says oh, why, how come you're paying attention to me? I'm just a foreigner, I'm nobody, why are you paying attention to this nobody? And he goes on to explain all the good stuff he's heard about Ruth. And so he's happy to be that channel or that tunnel of blessing unto Ruth. And so verse 2:14 says, Ruth ate all she wanted and had some left over. So he didn't just give her a tiny bit and said, oh, pat myself on the back, I did a great job. But he really gave abundantly. And so here's another example of Hesed. The next one is Boaz's workers. So the way they interact with Boaz in Ruth 2, verse 4, as Boaz comes and goes and takes care of his farming, his business, his people, the harvesters, some belong to him, right? And some, I imagine, are just seasonal who come in to do the work. He says, the Lord be with you. And they said, the Lord bless you. You can tell from their responses that he's not an oppressive taskmaster, nor a demanding person. He's very generous and laid back. And there's this mutual blessing on both sides. Furthermore, for the citizens of Bethlehem, later in Ruth 4, there's two, I think, big areas where the citizens of Bethlehem kind of play a part if this was a play. The first one is at the city gate when Boaz approaches the kinsman redeemer and does that exchange of hey, I just want you to let you know, brother, my cousin, this is what's happening. Will you take advantage of this or not? And later, when all the women talk to Naomi and praise her and say Ruth is better than 7 sons. This is great. Praise God for the hardship he's given you, but this great witness and success. And later, so Ruth 4, verse 11, they say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. And so they're saying later on in verse 12, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So they're just blessing Naomi, they're blessing Ruth, they're blessing Boaz, just with all the best things that they can say. And so these townspeople, these citizens of Bethlehem, they're not just background players, but it shows the culture of the times. And this is actually the time of Judges, when people were rebelling, when people weren't following really God's law. And so to see them just bless their townsmember like that is very great.
Yeah, they very could have easily just gossiped about her, and because she's a foreigner, she's not one of them. And like you said, there were some people that treated her poorly, and dare you say racist. And here you are, have some people that actually lifting her up and doing the very opposite of that.
Yeah, absolutely. The last group is it's an overlap, but the women of the town, they once. Ruth got married to Boaz and they had their son. All the women said, this is Ruth 4, verse 14. So praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. So this kind of rings, right? Not just of irony, but of, wow, God's in the details of the townspeople are blessing Naomi. And indeed, he became famous through Israel. He became Obed, who's the father of Jesse, who's the father of, David, King David. And so they go on to say, your daughter-in-law is better than seven sons. I mean, 7 sons. That's quite a bit. Not even one upstanding son, 7 sons. And and so I think these examples of Hesed, I really wanted to show to and display before my 4th through 6th graders at the time, because I think as kind of preteen agers, it was hard for them to see what it means to be kind and the ripple effects of being kind, of God's faithfulness and how God works in our lives, even though it's not outwardly apparent. God really is at work. And so we always do this challenge statement at the end of each sermon. And the challenge for that week was show Hesed, God's loving kindness to those around you. And literally, I kept it that vague, those around you, because in our story, it covered everyone, right? From the main characters to sub-characters to people around you, to people who are related to you, people who were not related, only maybe by marriage, but also the foreigner, which is, we think it's a foreign or different concept, but it's really God's idea to include the foreigners.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, living in America, I don't really understand the concept of a foreigner, although I did get a chance to live in South Korea for a little over a year. And although I had my wife to lean on, she knows Korean, she knows how to interact. And so I kind of leaned on her most of the time to communicate with people, get us places, and get things working up and running for us. But there were a few times where I ventured on my own. I went to the city by myself, going on the subway, buying food, asking where the toilets are, that sort of thing. And although South Korea does make it pretty simple for English speakers to get around and do what they need to, a lot of people know at least basic English. So even though it's broken, I can still get the point across, which was very nice. But then there were times where you run into people that don't speak any English, and then there's me speaking broken Korean and trying to figure everything out like that. And so I got a glimpse of what it's like to be a foreigner. And yeah, it can be a scary thing to, knowing that you don't have anything to go back to. Whereas, I had a backup in case, I needed to. There's translator apps and whatnot, but back in the day, there aren't smartphones in biblical times. There's, if you're a foreigner, you typically won't have any family around or any friends around. You're in a new land, and you just have to make do with what skills you have and trying to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even Naomi going back to her land after living somewhere else, I can just imagine, people even treating perhaps your wife differently just because she had lived in America and then come back to Korea. And so that idea of foreigner, I think, has many layers of you're not native and you didn't stay in our land, in our country the whole time. And so there is a bit of a distance judgment based on outer looks. Usually they can catch people who have lived abroad fairly easily because of their accent and even the way they dress. And so, even you being a foreigner there, I'm wondering, so many Koreans know English, but they're so shy about it. I wonder, like, if you approach them, what they thought in their head, like, oh shoot, why did you choose me to ask this question? Like, I mean, I can answer it, but I don't want to. Like, I'm so shy about my speech and my pronunciation. Like, will I be okay? Like, they have this like native Korean people have this like inner turmoil of like, oh, I want to be like, have the perfect pronunciation and have the perfect dialogue. But I mean, it's conversation, right? You kind of trip, you can stumble over words and it's fine.
Yeah. And I think there's a little more grace on my part as far as what you just described, because I would try to break that tension by initiating with what Korean I knew. Although, I knew that my Korean was broken and is atrocious, but I went out and put it on there. But, for someone that, being picked out and like on the spot, oh shoot, what kind of English do I know? I feel like that's a lot more heavy on somebody. Although, I definitely wanted my Korean to be perfect and I was trying to put my best foot down and, I was self-conscious in that way. I think it was a completely different story for those who I was talking to. This is a great point.
Yeah. I like how you use your broken Korean first to say to show and tell them like, hey, I'm not afraid to stumble and I want to relate to you and connect with you in your language. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, it was really bad.
I did another sermon where the theme or the title was From Empty to Full. And I dove into what it looked like to be empty in the whole story of Ruth and to be full in that story. And so there were some aha moments that came up in that. And I think it's a kind of a universal feeling too, right? Emptiness or loneliness or lack. And then the fullness that God gives us. That actually only God can give us. Of course, we can feel full in many ways through food, through the various different comforts in life. But this was really interesting to walk through. And so I can kind of give you a bird's eye overview. But first, I had highlighted Naomi, how she experienced emptiness. It was first literally food. So going over how Bethlehem is means house of bread. And yet she had to go somewhere else for that because there was famine and drought in the land, and how she became empty because she had no male support. Her husband died and her 2 sons died in a very largely male dominated patriarchal society where when women become widows, there's no one to take care of them, which is why God explicitly writes in the Bible to take care of the widows and orphans, because people weren't doing that naturally, I think. You don't look out for someone's survival when you're trying to survive too. And so God highlighted that. And then lastly, Naomi was empty. Her home, she had left Israel and gone to Moab, and that home was barren and empty for her too, as her husband and sons died. And so this emptiness was a very deep one that she had carried. She even asked people to call her Mara instead of Naomi, because she's saying, the Almighty God has made my life bitter. So just call me bitter, because this is my identity. This is who I am from now on. And so I think that really resonated deeply within me, and to help the congregation move through that, I was bringing up questions of, what is our hope? And, where really is the evidence that God is at work? What are things that he has done in our past or is currently doing, even if we might not be able to see it? Like, what are these things that we could bring up? And then the flip side, right, from empty to full, well, it's those 3 things once again: fullness and food. When Naomi came back, Boaz just like filled Ruth's gleaning bags so much that she just brought her leftover lunch, her leftover, like all the wheat leftover from his fields. And so they were able to survive as, family unit of two. In terms of male support, like Boaz going out of his way to become the kinsman redeemer. Yeah, when he's like this very single eligible bachelor, he didn't have to marry a foreign widow, but he goes out of his way to do that. So God brought fullness in male support. And I think also in the way Obed was born to Ruth, when the women of the town talk about it, they accredit Obed, her grandson, as like her son too. They accredit Naomi as 7 sons. And so there's all this credit and building up of, oh, you're no longer this widow, a lonely widow that's at the bottom of the food chain kind of in society. There's people looking after you and taking care of you. And lastly, home. She has found a home back in Israel, back in Bethlehem. This is her home once again. And she gets woven into the story of Jesus. And so I think this can be very true today in our lives, that God brings fullness through relationship, through relief, and through reliance on him. And so those were kind of the 3 things that I think we forget sometimes when we focus too much on what we're lacking, our own personal emptiness, because everyone has a story. Everyone has come from a place where they felt abandoned or lacking from God, no matter outwardly how, wealthy or put together we look. We go through seasons of emptiness and loneliness. And so I think in so many ways, the story of Ruth is very relatable, that just because it's a story of a woman doesn't mean that only girls have to read it and look at it. I think it does augment having the Bible highlight 2 women. I think augments and expands God's message, because women really were so low in society, and to see God take care of them and even kind of highlight them in such a patriarchal society shows the worth of women, that they're not just valuable because they bear children or that they do the housework, but there's some other intrinsic value within them too.
Oh, of course. I love that you mentioned that the book of Ruth and other books like Esther are not just for girls or women to read. It's for everybody. I found so much out of the book of Ruth while reading it, that, why it was on my list to put on this podcast to make an episode about it, and even multiple episodes about it, because there's just so much to extract out of this. And it's so important to hear, women's stories within the Bible, because there's so many other stories that are very male dominant, and there's male voices. Even the book of Ruth has a lot of question as far as who actually wrote the book of Ruth. Was it written by Ruth? Is it actually her voice? Is it written by a male author in trying to replicate the voice of a woman? There's no actual consensus as far as the author of Ruth or the actual thinking behind the writing of this book. And but regardless, you still get a story about a woman in the Bible that is actually her being the lead character, I guess I should say. And it's just so refreshing to have that in a biblical text. Like I said, it's just so dominant by male voices.
Yeah, that's very true. Sometimes in children's ministry, we talk about the different characters of the Bible as heroes of the Bible, but we fail to, then they become one-dimensional characters. We only highlight one aspect of them, whether faith in God or trusting in God or some kind of action that they took. But I found that I really like highlighting them as just human beings who and put the focus more on God. Because when we say like heroes of the Bible are Noah or Moses or David, well, they have their own weaknesses, which is we can't fault them for it because they're just human. And yet a lot of my kids have said like, hey, if I were Adam or if I were Eve, I would not have taken that fruit. And in my head, I'm thinking, these are young kids. So in my head, I'm thinking like, just wait, like you'll come to this realization, like you probably would have taken the fruit too in that situation in the garden. And so, to paint different characters in the Bible as heroes, even Ruth as a hero, even Boaz as a hero, I think it's too one-dimensional. I think there are layers to people, layers to the work that God was doing in each of the characters. And here, of course, so many good things are highlighted, right? And we see the emptiness to the fullness, of course, in Naomi. We don't see as much, I think, in Ruth and Boaz, perhaps. But instead of having one-dimensional characters, I do like that this goes deeper. This is kind of smack in the middle of the Bible almost, and yet it refers both to the past, which is all the Levitical laws and how society should be run and what happens if someone dies and no one takes care of the land and the widow and the children. And it also goes forward to David's time and even all the way to Jesus. And so it's like this great bridge.
Oh, of course. And isn't the book of Ruth, I forget if it's the last book in the Torah or if it's the first book in the Talmud?
Yes.
Yeah, so the Talmud. So I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. My pronunciation is going to do just like this whole podcast. I'm just going to be butchering
it's okay.
words and phrases that are originally Hebrew and whatnot. I'm just going to very Americanize this thing.
Yes, because we don't have that background, and so we might get things
I haven't
wrong.
studied it. And going back to like learning Korean, speaking the alphabet is a much different way to make the sounds as opposed to the English language. And it's the same thing with like Hebrew, Greek. There's different ways of how you make the sounds, based on the characters, and that translation just gets so butchered and lost in the English translation.
Absolutely. Even Hesed, Americanized version is probably Hesed, but there's this like deep neck guttural sound you're supposed to make with the H sound. So it's supposed to be like Hesed. And I found that there's a trend on the East Coast of people naming their daughters Hesed.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't know because I was lived and grew up mostly in the West Coast, but yeah, I discovered that. I was like, oh, what a name to, name your child.
You mentioned women of the Bible having that voice in the Bible and how important that is. I'm curious if there are any other women in the Bible that have really impacted you, that speak deeply to you, that you think had a really big impact, whether it be their voice has been kind of small with, other sermons that you've heard, but their presence really should be a lot bigger, or anything that really kind of resonates with you.
I think I can mention two women right off the bat. One of them is Esther, just because it's my namesake. So Esther, her name means star, and also Mordecai, I think, highlights her position in society is, God has put you in such a place for such a time as this. And so in my own life, I've been kind of wondering and wrestling with God, what is the thing that you want me to contend for, whether in my life or in society? What is that thing that I would even dare to put my life on the line through fasting and prayer, that I would abandon everything else to stand up for? And so that's something that I continue to wrestle with even before I was called into ministry. So I was called into ministry relatively later on in life. I would say maybe like 28, 30 years old. And so even before that, I had wrestled with it because my parents are ministers. My dad's a minister. And so they had named me that. And I think they had put their hope kind of that God would use me in the workplace or, just wherever God had planted me. And so that was my own wrestling and struggling, just reading the story of Esther and seeing how she did attain a high level in society and how God did choose to use her. But she really did have to walk in faith and put a lot of things on the line. She had to risk her life because of her identity. If it was revealed that she was Jewish, she would have been killed. And so I think that spurred me on to consider and think about and actually practice I would say the art of prayer, right? Praying is so deep, like it has many layers. It's not just forming sentences before God, but sometimes there's literal groaning in the spirit, where, there's a topic to pray on, but I run out of words. And so I'm just like offering to God this time of intercession, but not sure what to say. And so there is that kind of groaning of the spirit going on. And another lady I can bring up is Anna in the Bible. I forgot which gospel she comes out in.
Let me look at this really fast here. I actually have the page loaded up.
Oh, great.
So
she comes out.
Luke 2:22, and then also 36 through 38.
Awesome. So in Luke, she comes out almost like back to back with another man of prayer, Simeon, where Anna, her background is she became widow early on, and then for so many decades, she just served at the temple. And through serving, and I think through prayer, God allowed her to know that his son, the Messiah would come. And so she waited for that day. And so her devotion and commitment, not only to the church, the temple, or the synagogue kind of as an institution, but her lifestyle as someone who readily received this hope, this eternal hope, and held on to it and was actively looking around for the fulfillment of that, I think deeply moved me to continue to pray and to continue. Well, even the topic of prayer, like what do you pray about, right? When God puts something on your heart, I think it really goes beyond personal prayer requests of God, make me healthy, or God, help me to get into so-and-so college, something beyond that, but to shifting the priorities and focus away from me and more towards the body of Christ, or even different nations and societies. And so it's been exciting to imagine what God could put on my heart and what he is calling me to pray and intercede for without me even knowing like what that would look like in the end.
Of course. Anna is such an interesting character too, because her mention is very short. So it's only really mentioned in verse 36 through 38 of Luke 2, chapter 22, or Luke chapter 2, verse 36 through 38. And just makes me think of other women that have been mentioned only in a couple verses. Mm-hmm. Yet you can extract so much about them through other documentation about them or cultural, just things you can pull out culturally in that time frame as far as what had been mentioned and what we know historically had been going on in the time that these books have been written. Mm-hmm. It makes me think of Junia in the book of Romans, and she's only mentioned in like 3 verses or something like that.
Wow, it's very short.
Or 4. It's very short, mm-hmm. But I think there's like 5 different things you can say with absolute certainty about who she is and how she was perceived and how the other apostles viewed her and elevated her as a apostle of Jesus. And it's just so cool that you can pull that much information out of just a few verses of mentioning this person. And also about, for, what is it, 2,000 years or so, she was actually written off as a male person. She was written off as Junius, and they recently looked at the text again. Someone discovered, hey, this isn't right. And they realized that this is actually a woman that they were talking about, and which opened a whole flood of doors of discussion as far as, are women allowed to preach in the church in a leadership role and be, the head of the church. And so I love those discussions. I love all of them. I love hearing what people talk about, what they bring up as far as, facts, scripture, all that kind of stuff. And, where I stand, I love the idea of women in leadership roles in the church. And this is why I love having conversations like we are today and talking about even topics like right now about, women in the Bible and women that have had influence on people and how it influences us even. So,
yes. I think those topics are important to have because I think there could be a misconception. I'm not sure of all the different steps to how the misconception is made, but oftentimes there is this questioning, if a woman is a senior pastor of a church or if a woman is leading and there are men, quote unquote, under her, what is this authority that she is able to have and who gives her that authority? Well, I think when you talk to women, actually, they would rather not have that authority or have something so controversial. I think women, most often women, like people who are called into ministry, women ministers, they were just obeying the call of God on their lives, which is, would you commit to this? Would you step in the gap? Would you serve in this way that is selfless? Would you be a shepherd to these lost sheep? And so I distinctly remember a breakfast where there were a bunch of seminarians and this one woman minister, and she was getting grilled. She's saying they were bringing up questions of which theologian said what about women being okayed for ministry, women not being okayed for ministry. And she just humbly said, in my case, I did not enter ministry to have some kind of authority over anybody, but it was just God's natural calling for me. And I obeyed each step. And I was so moved by her answer because that's what I found to be true in my own life too. I think I struggled greatly with whether I wanted to be ordained or not. So ordained is kind of licensing in the professional sense, but within the church, it's more, it's you're acknowledging that God has called you into ministry, but how that looks like in the church, right? They give you a title of pastor or reverend or minister. And so it ends up being a big deal. And previously I was at a Presbyterian church where they did not ordain women. So my struggle was, well, I came to the conclusion, as long as I'm at this church, I will be okay, with not being ordained because the church and the people in the church fully acknowledge women, allow us to do ministry in such a wide breadth. There is no point, I felt, in rocking the boat, so to speak, and being like the first to be like, no, I want this title and this recognition. That's what it felt like at the time. In wrestling with it, I was like, oh, I don't need to rock the boat. I don't need the title or the recognition or someone giving me, this 목사님 title over 전도사님. These are Korean terms for pastor, and then like youth pastor or children's pastor, something a little bit hierarchical. But I really wrestled with that and came to the conclusion on my own that said, I'm okay with not having that title. But I found that within the culture of the church, though, when all the men would go and do the denominational meetings, or when a young pastor would go through the process of becoming ordained, and how the individual would have to stand in front of a room full of pastors and be grilled, be really grilled on their character and also their view of the Bible and their interpretation of the Bible. And the women collectively kind of staying back at church saying like, we don't have to deal with that. Like, we're okay where we are at. That bothered me actually, because I felt that it was almost a cop-out, that I began to wonder, hey, if I was put on the spot like that, what would I say? I can no longer defer to the church or my denomination for their stances. I would actually need to take a stance. But it's really hard to take a stance on some very theological, debatable issues because the Bible, sometimes if you study it this way, it says you can find so much evidence for one way and maybe so much evidence for the opposing way. And so many things in the Bible, there's evidence for both. And we honestly don't know until I'm sure we maybe die and go to heaven and ask God himself. And theology is also something that is constantly, I feel like, transforming and refining and getting better as time goes on because it gets refined. Also, God reveals certain things at crucial times. I mean, people used to die for their theological beliefs. We don't kill people anymore over their theological beliefs, thank goodness. But that was a thing where I began to think maybe I do want to be ordained because that would require me to take accountability for what I believe and what I teach in the church. If I'm going to be a shepherd, if I'm going to be an under shepherd of God to take care of the sheep, the flock before me, I want to know what I'm teaching. I want to be sure about it, not just because it's some kind of stance that the church that I'm attending has, but because I have a deep conviction, because I feel spirit led about this. And so I think that was one of the reasons why, my husband and I are both on this path to be ordained. It's been a very interesting journey, a very humbling journey. By no means is it to attain some kind of status or power, but I think it continues to humble me because I have to bring things before God and say, God, I don't know what this says. Can you reveal it more to me? And to me, being in children's ministry, I really have to simplify things even further for the kids. Otherwise, if it's too complex, if I'm using too many words to explain it, they don't get it either.
Yeah. It's so nice to hear you say that because, after interacting with you over the past couple of years and getting to know you, I feel like you walk the talk. I feel like with all these, pastors or leaders in the church that have been uncovered as, having scandals or whatnot, you start to lose trust that they're actually walking the talk. But I can say firsthand that you have. I feel like everything you've said, I've seen prior to this conversation from you. And it's just, it's refreshing to actually have people in your life that are actually doing what they preach, what they say, and continuing learning and professing that, and not just getting stale in their walk through biblical theology and their relationship with Christ. It's good, and I feel like I've seen that with a lot of the leadership at our church in particular. It's a small church. There's really not too many people at the church, especially when you look at a lot of other churches, in America here, in the world even. But I feel like it's just a good group of people, and we're constantly strengthening each other. Iron sharpens iron.
Yes.
And we, I feel like, not all of us are having podcast episodes. We're having conversations, but we are having conversations in different aspects, in different environments, different ways. Weekly, we have prayer nights each week that, a good chunk of us, go to, and we all fellowship together. We all talk about things. Then we have our prayer time and worship. And, it's just a good thing we've got going on. And, I pray and I hope that, this church continues to do that as it grows. And I feel like we've got a good base.
Yes. I'm very excited. I love our church and how we seek to be Bible-based, that we sometimes take a step back and just say, wonder what it would be like to be on the other side, the other person's shoes, and to genuinely enjoy times together. We love eating together.
Oh, certainly.
All the time. We eat so well. There's a running joke, right? When you join our church, you're going to gain 10 pounds easily because we eat so well. And that's what bonds us and allows us to openly share about our lives over breaking bread, about different struggles that we're having. And so I'm really grateful. Something new that we've done this year is to have like a midweek gathering, right? Of a small group during the week, which we didn't have before. Everything was done on Sundays before. And so it's been a good move of the church to, I think, recognize that to have something midweek allows us to pause during our busyness, our lives, and to pause and to talk about God and to connect with each other.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I agree. Esther, this has been a great conversation. I've had such an enjoyable time.
Same here.
Yeah.
I've loved sharing what I've learned, what I've been able to use for God's people. I feel like I did like a couple mini sermons on here now, but I hope that it's been helpful in other people's walks with God too.
Of course. Esther, thank you so much for coming out. Yeah, thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That is it for today's episode of Grub and Grace. I hope you enjoyed our discussion with Esther Park about being a foreigner in a new place. I want to give a big thank you to our guests for joining us on this episode. Music is by Fleece Mob with the song Everything You Need. Graphics and visuals by Root and Branch Creative. Remember to visit our website, grubandgrace.com. That's grubandgrace.com, as well as our socials on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Until next time, stay curious, keep an open mind, and celebrate the traditions that bring us all together. This week's recipe is a savory cornbread and mashed potato cake, a delicious combination of fluffy potatoes and cornbread, perfect as a side dish or taking center stage. Visit our website for the full recipe and tips to make this comforting and show-stopping dish at home and in perfect time for Thanksgiving. Enjoy!